session one will be on the three generations of classicists. And in that, I'm seeing a familiar face in Mr. Catesby Leigh, and a very familiar face in Professor Westfall, who I've missed our coffees in Richmond, Virginia. But we also have a new classicist to the scene, and that's Mr. Fisher Derderian. Mr. Derderian is the executive director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. And Mr. Derderian is likewise coordinator for this session. So I will now yield the floor to him.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session. I have the pleasure to be the coordinator of three generations of classicists, and the impossible task of following up Leon Creer and his wonderful keynote. So have pity on us a little bit here. But regardless, I'm quite excited for today's session. We, as the name of the session makes clear, are three generations, and we will go in the order of most senior to most junior here. The way we will be doing this is there'll be three short talks from Bill first, then Catesby, then myself, followed by a time of discussion and some Q&A. So please, as we're going through and making our presentations, feel free to write some questions up, ask questions in the chat box, and we will get to them later on during these 50 minutes that we have. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce both Bill and Catesby, and then we'll get started. Professor Carroll William Westfall is Professor Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame's School of Architecture, where he previously served as the Frank Montana Professor and Chairman of the school from 1998 to 2002. Before coming to Notre Dame, Professor Westfall taught at Amherst College, the University of Illinois in Chicago, and since 1982 at the University of Virginia. His undergraduate training at the University of California was followed by completion of a master's degree at the University of Manchester and a PhD at Columbia University under the supervision of Professors R. Whitcoer and P.O. Christeler. His initial work led to numerous articles and a book, In This Most Perfect Paradise, which is a study of Renaissance Rome. His more recent studies of the relationship between the history, theory, and practice of architecture are found in his contribution to the 1991 book, Architectural Principles in the Age of Historicism, written with Robert Jan van Pelt. Catesby Leigh was born and raised in Washington, D.C. After graduating from Princeton, he spent most of the 1980s in South America as a foreign correspondent for the Cox newspapers chain. Visiting many cities and towns in the region, he grew increasingly interested in traditional architectural environments and was struck by their modernist counterparts' failure to achieve comparable levels of visual or physical amenity. After moving back to the United States, Leigh met with the distinguished architectural historian Henry Hope Reed, who became a mentor. Leigh's first architectural articles appeared in 1991. Since then, his commentary has appeared in publications including the Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, National Review, First Things, City Journal, and the Claremont Review of Books. Leigh is also a co-founder and past chairman of the National Civic Art Society. So with that, Bill, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
How do I get started? How do I get my, do I share the screen? Is that it?
Yes, yes.
All right, how do I get my, and there's my PowerPoint, I think. And how do I get full screen for that?
You have a present icon, Bill. I think he needs to be pointed to the present icon, Fisher.
I have a present icon.
Let's see.
What does a present icon look like?
It's the upper left-hand corner of your screen.
To the right a little bit more there, Bill. One of these. Try going up to the top left corner and then go a couple icons over, Bill.
Yeah.
Further over, one more.
Beyond the refresh, to the side of the refresh. One over, Bill.
What?
There you go. That should do it, I think.
No, that's
Yes.
That's a new slide. I don't need a new slide. Oh, we're up here. Are we up here?
Oh, you're there. Your presentation. Can't you just click on it? Click on the slide.
Look at where the arrow is. There is a present.
Down here. What?
Mr. Westfall, At the top of the screen, it has
What's that?
grading.
Is that what I'm looking for?
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's great, Bill.
Yes.
And how do I go forward? Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay. I've always wanted to do this, which is to start with an autobiographical statement that says, I was born at a very early age. And indeed, the earliest picture I could find is me in my soldier suit with my two sisters and my mother there in Fresno during World War II, too young to go to war. And there I am on the right in my present habitation, where I sit in front of a computer and use my fingers to do the walking and the talking. And I've often thought that perhaps one of the things that got me into classical architecture in the first place was the contact that I had with my high school, which is on the scene there. They don't build them like that anymore, but they certainly should. And when that building became unusable because of its earthquake dangers and so on, they tore down most of it, but what did they keep? The parts that you see here. And why did they do that? Because they knew they couldn't do any better. But I didn't know that then. I went off to Berkeley, and while I was there for a year, I took a summer off and went to Berlin. That's me in East Berlin in 1958. Can you believe it? 1958 in East Berlin. I've gained weight since then. And I went back to Berkeley and I completed my initial undergraduate education in the history of art. And I learned I want to get rid of, I've got this stuff over here. How do I get rid of it? Oh, there. I learned the magic formula of the history of art. I didn't quite realize that's what they were teaching me, but this was it. The zeitgeist produces the influences that determine the changing styles of the arts. So all I had to do was to learn what the zeitgeist was, and they produced the influences, and then I would learn the name of the styles and attach them to various artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and architecture. And it didn't make any difference what the artifact was, painting, architecture, or sculpture. They were all the same. They were important as artifacts. So I finished at Berkeley, and then I went to the University of Manchester, which is seen there on the left. I have never seen it like that because when I was there, it was as dark as soot. But once they got the clean air ordinances going in Britain, they washed the buildings. And the view on the right is more of what I saw. I spent the summer, it was a 2-year program, I spent the summer on a Lambretta, which you see there, not that particular one. And I toured Italy. I went from Manchester through Germany and France and Switzerland and Italy down to Brindisi, took the ferry over to Athens, looked at the Parthenon and that stuff, came back, made a return trip, visiting other places all through Italy and so on, looking at buildings, finding what the influences were of the zeitgeist and the names of the buildings. I then went to the University of, I went to Columbia, where I studied with Rudolf Wittkover and Paul Oster Christeller, and with my old undergraduate instructor, who was Jim Ackerman, whom you see there. He came up to New York and gave a talk at Columbia. And that's me picking my nose while he's talking to me, looking down on me. But at Columbia, I managed to perfect my knowledge of the zeitgeist, the influences, and the styles. And I then started teaching them at Amherst College, which had the wonderful advantage of having a 1-year full salary scholarship to produce research, which I did. I went to Rome and I studied the buildings in Rome that were produced in the middle of the 15th century, which was quite a trick because there was almost nothing. It was mainly a development of the idea that became very important for me later, that there is something more important than the architect in producing a building. It turns out to be the patron who has a particular purpose. But I had a wonderful time in Rome. These are earlier pictures. I lived in the lower left, you can see the street I lived on with a wonderful view of Rome, except that the the Pantheon blocked it. And then I went to work at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And one of the first things I did when I got there, a city I'd known pretty well anyway, I went to take a look at the Sullivan's Old Stock Exchange, and it wasn't there. There was a hole in the ground. And for the first time, I learned that a building is not like a painting. It's not something you declare to be a masterpiece and you remove and put it in a museum. Instead, you assess its economic viability and you tear it down or you build a new one. So I got involved in preservation, which was a tremendous benefit. And in preservation, I managed to learn again the importance of politics. I was teaching at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and you see it there in the upper left-hand corner, Walter Netsch's Concrete Nightmare. The University of Illinois at Chicago Circle, it was called at the time, probably the only university named after a traffic interchange, which you see there. And I got involved in preservation, went to New York, and went to Washington for a conference and thought, well, I'm going to take a day off and go down to see something I've never seen, but I talk about all the time, which was the University of Virginia. And that's what I saw. And I had an overwhelming epiphany. There are two things wrong with the world. One is, I'm not here, I'm in Chicago instead. I took care of that the next year. And the other is, in architecture, newer is not necessarily better. In fact, it's often quite worse. While there, I had a chance to participate in the Pompeii Forum project. You see me in the two upper photos looking for something to eat there on the left, going into the arena on the right. And I also had a chance to go to Guatemala, that wonderful example of urbanism. It has a lot of the tricks that Leo Creer was just talking about in the spacing of buildings relative to the urbanism. And it was a wonderful opportunity with wonderful friends that I've had a chance to know over the years. And from that, I also learned something about the orders. In earthquakes, it's good to have something very stout there on the right. And in timber, you can do something skinny. And we saw some wonderful examples in Leo's wonderful presentation that addressed those issues. And then I went to the University of Notre Dame, and I had a chance to develop some ideas that I had learned at Virginia, in part because of a wonderful talk that Leo gave the first year I was there, or second year maybe, in which he put a chair, an easy chair, on the stage of the lecture room. And he had a dialogue with Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't there, in which he outlined the importance of older is sometimes newer, sometimes better, that tradition is important, and other such things that I then began to question from the formula of zeitgeist equals influences equals changing styles. And also while at Virginia, I had a wonderful dialectic interchange with Robert Jan van Pelt concerning architectural principles, which are lacking in modernism, in part because of historicism. And we had a good round debate, which is in the book. And then I began to reformulate a different understanding of architecture. And this is my present understanding. Whoops. Trying to get rid of, there it is. And I've come to conclude that style serves partisanship. Partisanship is something that engages in a dialectic of people of goodwill aimed at a political life that attempts to serve justice in the common good. And its counterpart is the architecture that serves justice. So that architecture provides beauty, and that is the counterpart to the justice that is the basis for the good life, for the noble life, for the common good. So treating architecture as a sequence of styles demeans architecture. Styles change in response to the influences of the zeitgeist and other notions that individuals accept, which allows them to avoid their obligation to contribute to the common good. If you hear the word influence, flee from the speaker. In contrast, architects who use their talent and skill as they draw on tradition and revise it to address changed circumstances, provide the beauty that is the counterpart to justice, the central content of the common good, and that is the proper topic of the history of architecture. That is what historians ought to be teaching future architects, and that is what future architects and practicing architects ought to be studying when they look at the old buildings, using the eyes that Leo has so marvelously portrayed for you. And that is what I have to say. And this is where I say it. That's my house here in Richmond. That's my latest book. And the thing I'm working on now is with Samir Yunus, whom you will hear about later in this program. I'm done.
Very good. Thanks, Bill. If you
Thank
could
you,
go
Bill.
ahead and end your screen share. There we go.
What's that?
You did it. I was just going to say, go ahead and end your screen share, and then we'll go ahead and go to Catesby now. So if you could begin sharing your screen and give your talk, Catesby.
There we go.
The United States Capitol, to which my late mentor, Henry Hope Reed, devoted his final book, embodies an ancient formal canon, as well as an ancient artistic ethos in which the community takes precedence over modernity's apotheosized self. Even though
Catesby, can you press the slideshow button down at the bottom right?
Yes, slideshow button down at the bottom right.
Right there where your arrow was. To the right, to the right. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Even though the building enshrines a democratic republic founded on modern ideas of government as the guarantor of the individual citizen's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The Capitol speaks eloquently to the classical tradition's adaptability, just noted by Bill Westfall, to changing social and cultural circumstances across space and time. And we can add changing technological circumstances if we consider its sublime cast iron dome. Romanticism's exaltation of the creative genius as a law unto him or herself steadily undermined the classical premise that a community of interest exists between artist and public, an assumption that had withstood the emergence of a new reverence for the exceptionally creative personality during the Renaissance. Romanticism made a decisive contribution to modernism's eventual triumph. But the classical canon is still with us. And the main reason is its aesthetic power. Classical architecture's organic complexity not only derives from the human body, but also accommodates human modes of perception to a degree unmatched by any other architectural idiom. It resonates with us in strictly aesthetic terms, both physiologically and intellectually. In classical architecture, as in classical sculpture and painting, power inheres first, foremost, and indispensably in form, not meaning. With modernism, form is routinely subordinated to meaning in architecture and art alike. And for quite some time now, modernists have been in the business of making ugliness meaningful. Ugliness, it turns out, is redolent of authenticity. It speaks to what's really real in a fragmented world supposedly devoid of objective meaning. And of course, only the initiated can appreciate what's really real. Yet beauty still matters hugely, and there's no reason to doubt that the public at large embraces it. That was always Henry Reed's assumption. He was not a theorist. His writing revolved around our sensuous or perceptual response to architecture. And he regarded modernism as revolving around the mortification of the senses. In his writing, we encounter cogent analysis of the elements of a given classical design and the overarching aesthetic logic guiding a given architectural arrangement. But Henry was also well aware that classical architecture endows the various realms of community endeavor, governance, worship, education, commerce, and so on, with an ideal dimension. And not only classical architecture, but all the great humanistic idioms, especially Gothic. He understood that modernists are aware of that power, that they fear it, and that they instinctively wish to abolish architecture's metaphysical ramifications. Henry believed that so far as architecture's enduring potential for beauty and grandeur are concerned, we can indeed build them like we used to. That worthy aim is typically opposed by the modernist apparatchiks ensconced in our legacy media, academic institutions, museums, big city real estate development firms, and official design review boards. To a remarkable degree, this elite now plays the role the aristocracy once played in Europe. It plays it very badly because it is too often guided not by taste grounded in sound artistic knowledge, but rather by fashionable theories or stylistic fads that do not resonate with normal people, along with a rarefied celebrity culture that glorifies the likes of Frank Gehry and Tom Main. Another challenge lies in the fact that modernism's functionalist conceits have encouraged the mutation of buildings, ranging from suburban tract houses to courthouses, from artifacts into commodities. Today's traditional architects and community planners confront a situation in which developers are geared more to investment cycles than the long term. Upfront costs are minimized. Building more long-term value into a design, whether in terms of quality construction or refinement of detail, is easily dismissed as wasteful, as conspicuous consumption, to employ Thorstein Veblen's coinage. Even when iconic status is sought through histrionic eccentricity, that also is a reflection of a commodified architectural culture. There are, of course, latter-day classical architects like John Blateau, who, benefiting from enlightened patronage, have very skillfully employed modern construction technology and building for the long term, as with Blateau's handsome bank branch in Bethesda, Maryland. We need to get more facts on the ground that, like this handsome edifice, intimate at a small scale what traditional design can do to enrich our streetscapes, thereby promoting restoration of an architectural culture geared to the long term. Over the last quarter century, we've seen more such facts in the form of institutional buildings, houses of worship, residential colleges, and other buildings at our universities, and yes, courthouses, that clearly demonstrate traditional architecture's superiority to what modernism has to offer. I would also like to mention an early new urbanist community, Kentons in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which I first visited nearly 30 years ago. The planners, Dwani and Plater-Zyberk, were up against a simplistic suburban development paradigm that, among other things, prioritized the accommodation of automobile traffic as opposed to pedestrians. The planners had serious problems with county officials, builders, and last but not least, the regional housing market, which tanked just as construction got underway. DPZ and Kentland's enlightened but beleaguered developer, who wound up handing the project over to his bankers, had little traction with builders when it came to enforcing their architectural code. I'll always remember a Wall Street Journal review in which the commentator said the details on Kentland's houses are so bad they make your teeth hurt. Still, even in those early days, the planners' emulation of the functional and aesthetic virtues of places like Georgetown and the historic core of Annapolis was legible and heartening. In the intervening decades, Kentland's has steadily improved, and today it's widely recognized as an urbanistic model. The historic city, the city monumental, was Henry Reed's main concern, however. The finest opportunity right now to show the public what enlightened architecture and urbanism can do for our big cities lies in Richard Cameron's splendid plan for the reconstruction of Charles Follen McKim's late great Pennsylvania Station, accompanied by a new Madison Square Garden to be erected at a nearby location. Realization of this vision would change the architectural conversation in this country. I can't think of a plan that better reflects what Henry Hope Reed's life's work was all about. Thank you.
Wonderful, Catesby. Thank you so much. You can go ahead and insert on your screen. There we go. And so finally for my talk, I did not prepare a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself. And being the youngest classicist in the panel, I have the disadvantage, of course, of being young, but also have been a classicist the least amount of time. So I don't have any great insights or experiences from my life or from my work, at least thus far, that our two other panelists do. But regardless, I thought I'd just give a bit about my background, about the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and what we hope to achieve, and some thoughts from Roger as it relates to beauty and architecture. So I grew up actually not too far away from where Bill was born in Fresno, California. I grew up in Kingsburg, which is about 40 minutes south, on a small farm. It was a little rural community. There wasn't a sense of permanence there, at least not in my eyes. All around me were temporary buildings. The classic example of those wonderful temporary school buildings that I don't know if any of you had the great luxury of experiencing, but poorly ventilated in a hot place, and smelling of children's BO, which was not the best memories, but memories nonetheless. Looking around, I lived on a farm and had the experience of being close to the land, but that was more or less it. There was no real beauty in architecture around me. People, at least in my small farming community, didn't build to have beautiful buildings. They built for functionality. They built for utility on the farm, or they had limited resources in town, so there wasn't much to it. There were a couple small towns nearby, like Kingsburg, which had this beautiful Swedish character, but even then, it was very located, or very specifically located on the main street, and then outside of that, it went more or less to the rest of that sort of suburban sprawl. But the one thing that I think I did have, which put me on a proper footing, was my Armenian heritage. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Central California and its Armenian population, but it is great, and it is to a strong extent there. And there's a large diaspora that lives there. My father was heavily a part of it, having been full Armenian himself. And I got the sense of permanence, the sense of identity and community of a people that, through no other permanent things around them, still identified with who they were and continued those legacies and traditions. And so growing up in that, I got exposed to something different, something that was out of the ordinary, and something I consider myself lucky to have. And continuing my luck, I somehow got into college at the King's College in New York City, a small liberal arts institution, but in the great atmosphere of New York. And of course, when I was supposed to go, it was supposed to be in the Empire State Building, which is, to some young man from the Central Valley, some rural lands, was quite the attractive thing. And in the summer leading up to it, they moved it down to the financial district, which I thought was the greatest tragedy ever. But again, ended up being another great blessing, because going to school every day, and then after I graduated, going to work every day, I was surrounded by beautiful buildings, walking past Trinity Church every day to school and then work, walking past Federal Hall, walking past all these different buildings that you're surrounded by. It really instilled a sense of beauty and grandiosity in architecture that I could appreciate. And furthermore, living in New York City for about 7 years then taught me what it was like to live in a good urban environment, to live in a place that actually had some beauty to it, that had a sort of vernacular of its own. That wasn't just simply temporary houses put up or something of the sort, but had a sense of place, and wanted to continue it even as its uses and people living there changed. And so from there, I was introduced to Roger's work while I was a student in college. I began reading one of his books in a philosophy class or something of the sort, and was quite enamored with him. Here, as I've talked with many other people now who've had similar experiences, here was a man who can make explicit and say so beautifully all the things that we intuited, that we internally felt, that we had some premonition to, but could never actually vocalize, or if we could, did so in a rambling manner that was roundabout and never quite concise or clear. And let me see. And so through a series of circumstances after graduating and working at the college, found myself lucky enough to take Roger's MA program in philosophy at the University of Buckingham, which was the most lovely experience. I don't know if any of you have the opportunity to do something like this, or if any of you are shaping MA programs, but it's certainly the way to do it. We meet in the Reform Club, which was a few blocks down from Buckingham Palace in central London, and sit around and have lectures of philosophy in a back room, drink wine, talk and eat. And it was certainly a civilized way of life. And through this course, I got to know Roger a little bit. I began discussing with him the idea of creating a foundation, a nonprofit, an institution dedicated to supporting and furthering his work. And naturally, he quite liked this. I think here I was, this young man saying, let me help you, make a little bit more money and further your work and do something interesting with your time. Not that he wasn't already. And in his words, he would love to be able to be paid more while feeding his chickens at the farm. So I was just going about this with him. It took about a 2 to 3 year process as we began thinking through what such an institution might look like. And over the course of these 2 to 3 years, he gave me a signature. We moved forward with these different things. And naturally, or as I'm sure many of you know, he was diagnosed with cancer at one point, and then later passed away. And so this, greatly changed everything. Instead of working alongside the great master, I suddenly had to represent the great master, which, as you can see, I'm a very young man, and that was quite the intimidating, and still is the intimidating, but great challenge ahead of me. And so really, as we've been forming more and more what the foundation is to do, we, of course, have our mission statement, which is to establish Sir Roger Scruton's legacy through the conservation, care, and continuation of traditional wisdom and culture from the Western tradition. But what this really looks like is supporting people who share or at least sympathize with the Scrutonian vision, a vision that sees beauty as central in our experience of the world, that values the lived traditions that we've received from our ancestors, wishes to conserve them and pass them on. We're doing this through a number of different things, through architecture. Yes, we've had a great discussion on building beautiful, playing off of Roger's commission that he did in the last year of his life, but in music, in literature, in the natural environment, in philosophy, and more generally, humane learning and education. And one of the things that I think the foundation really ought to do is to foster a culture of gratitude, a culture that pushes forward oikophilia, which is a term Roger coined, a beautiful one, playing off of oikos and philia, the love of home, as he said. And it's not simply the love of your home building, but the love of your town, the love of the people that make up the home, the love of the traditions that make it up. And this is to be compared to what Roger also coined, which was oikophobia, which is the hatred of home or the resentment of home, the desire to destroy what is ours and favor what is not ours. And I think as we really start to think seriously about oikophilia and home and what makes it, beauty is a central and necessary aspect. It gets at the heart of establishing a home, and by making things beautiful around us, we reconcile us to our environment. I just want to quote a quick little piece from Roger where he says, "Much that is said about beauty and its importance in our lives ignores the minimal beauty of an unpretentious streets, a nice pair of shoes, or a tasteful piece of wrapping paper, as though these things belong to a different order of value from a church Barbamante or a Shakespeare sonnet. Yet these minimal beauties are far more important in our daily lives and far more intricately involved in our rational decisions than the great works which, if we are lucky, occupy our leisure hours. They are part of the context in which we live our lives, and our desire for harmony, fittingness, and civility is both expressed and confirmed in them." I think beauty, going off of some of the research I did with Roger and what I wrote my MA on, beauty in some sense, or at least art and the aesthetic interest, as Roger liked to use, is the way in which we can experience the world through our imagination. And there are 3 types of knowledge Roger distinguished. There's knowledge that, carbon and oxide make carbon dioxide. There's knowledge how, so you have knowledge how to ride a bike. And then there's knowledge what it is like to do something. And beauty, if it's done well, or art, can teach us this knowledge what. Although we can't go and fight wars or go and live great romantic lives, or at least not when we're so very young, we get to experience it through Shakespeare, through Ovid, or whoever it might be. We get to read these classical works and experience lives that are outside of ourselves. Through this suspension of belief, we enter into the imagination and live other people's lives. And this gives us sort of premonition, the feeling in which we know how to direct ourselves and know how to approach the world once we start to experience real things. And with Roger, his question was, how do we then take this importance of beauty and how does that actually shape and affect our practical reasoning? And he thought architecture was one of those areas that made most clear sense to approach it through this way. And specifically that the classical tradition gives us these sort of premonitions. If we're to act, we should act with our end in mind. And if we're to have an end in mind, we have to know, if we're to act, we should act with an end in mind, but we need to know what that end is. And through the classical tradition, through classicism, we have that ability. So there are a couple more thoughts that I can go into, but I want to cut it there because I think it'd be far more interesting to hear from our other panelists here. So I don't know if there are any questions. So perhaps if you'd like to ask any questions, go ahead and do so. But I'll ask Bill and Catesby, perhaps the most obvious one for myself, as a young man just entering the classical or the classicist world, what advice do you have? How should we pursue these things, how to enact them and how to advocate for them in our lives? Any thoughts?
Bill, you're the teacher. Why don't would you answer first? Because you have much more to say on this than I. How do you approach students these days? You're muted. You're muted, Bill. There you go.
I'm trying to find the question.
The question is that Fisher just posed is, how do you engage students, engage their interest in your architectural outlook, your aesthetic outlook?
How do I do it? Not very well. Not very well at all. I have been blessed by teaching in places where they are amenable to hearing it. University of Virginia, of course, was a tough sell, but there were graduate students there who understood what I was talking about, and some of them have been very generous in their comments about what they learned. University of Notre Dame, I think a great deal has to do with its Catholicism. There's an underlying understanding in Catholicism that there is a truth and that it is beyond individual knowledge, and that it is important to attempt to get at that truth. And that truth is related to things like goodness and justice and beauty. And I had a similar experience last year when I taught a theory course at Catholic University, commuted up from Richmond once a week for a semester. And again, the students could hear it. And I think that's important because, in part because they were Catholics. And one of the things I've always tried to do to get the hook into this, and there have been various people who have resisted it vehemently, is to go to natural law. And natural law takes me, of course, to certain principles that are self-evident truths that are inculcated and built into our political order. And that is the part of our political order that is under the greatest threat now from all kinds of misunderstandings. The latest being, for example, the misunderstanding of the intent of the executive order to restore beauty to the architecture of federal buildings. So it's a tough sell. And how do I do it? Apparently not very well.
Well, I'm being told we have about 3 minutes left before the session will end. So it looks like at least one question has come in that we can go to. It looks like someone else made some comments, but we'll just ask this one question and we'll have to wrap it up with that. But Alejandro says, what would Mr. Westfall, Leigh, and Derderian say is the importance of traditional architecture for the preservation, not just of the superficial physical aspects of a culture, but also the more profound world view? Would either of you gentlemen like to take a stab at that?
I think one of the important things about traditional architecture is that it conveys a teleology. And architecture in its original sense is the transfiguration of structure into an ideal entity. And so in times past, traditional architecture and classical architecture most conspicuously have spoken to the fact that our commercial republic, these United States of America, view commerce as a means to a higher end. And we think of that higher end as a civilized polity. And I don't think a functionalist aesthetic can begin to convey that teleological sense of what building is about. And I'm wary of the idea that that traditional architecture conveys, a specific message. I think it's fairer to say it conveys a sense of life, which is conducive to a civilized polity, a more civilized polity.
And I would add too, Roger always talked about with other forms of art, painting or music or so forth. These are private, and even though they're just as important in some sense as architecture, they're not forced, onto the passerby. They aren't things in which we all must experience. And architecture and traditional building, ideally, is something that we have to experience day to day. The person that has to walk by it every day to go to work or whatever it might be sees this, they're confronted with it, and they must reconcile themselves to it in some way, either making them feel at home in their town, in the world, or making them feel unsettled and lost. And different sorts of building styles communicate that, I think. But Bill, do you have any last comments? I think we're just at the end of our time here. I'm being told we have to go ahead and wrap up. But would you like to say anything else on this topic?
I want to reinforce if I can, I want to reinforce what Catesby just said, which is that we tend to put function above purpose. Mm-hmm. Purpose is meaningful to the individual life. And function are the things you do, like washing dishes, but eating is more important. And that has a purpose, which is sustaining life, and so on. And so influence, the zeitgeist, functionalism, style, watch your language. Know what you mean when you use those words.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, I think that about wraps it up now for this session. I don't know, Patrick or Nir, if you want to step in. But thank you so much, Bill and Catesby, for joining me on this panel. And thank you, everyone, again, for attending and listening. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful in it.